Welcome to another episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders, founder of NTX Vinyl, which is a small chain of record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not familiar, make sure and check us out at ntxvinyl.com. Obviously, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe on YouTube, wherever you may be watching this. This video is a little deceiving because while I may show a few records, I have been consumed with something other than spinning records from my collection recently, and that is the new Peter Jackson directed Beatles documentary, Get Back. Unless you've been living under a rock, you have probably heard or seen or read a lot about this film. Apparently, Peter Jackson's been working on it for 4 years. It was delayed because of COVID, and then now just recently came out over the Thanksgiving holiday, 2021. I have only seen it once, so this is a behemoth of a documentary. It spans 3 episodes, 8 hours-ish, and was culled from, I believe, like 50 or 60 hours of never before seen footage that Peter Jackson got access to. Additionally, there were hours and hours of audio, even more, I think, 100 hours or something of never before heard footage. So he got to go through those archives for the first time. They have been locked away for 50 years, which is an amazing thing. So we were all given this gift as Beatles fans, as music fans. I have been kind of consumed in thought with this thing because it takes 8 hours to watch it over the course of a couple days. And then that's a lot to digest, right? There are so many moments in the film where when you're watching it in real time, it's very exciting. But then by the time you get to the end of it, you have forgotten so much because it's so much to consume. So I'm very excited to go back and watch it. But keeping in mind that I've only watched it once, so I'm sure I'm going to get some stuff wrong as far as when things happen, specifically on which days. I'm going to generalize a little bit because I just don't remember because, again, it's a lot to take in. It's recorded. So the story of the film is very simple. I believe it originated as Paul's idea to film the Beatles writing, rehearsing, recording, and then performing what becomes the album Let It Be. Going into it, they have no idea what it's going to become. This is coming out of a period where the Beatles were very experimental and they were using the studio as an instrument. So they were creating albums, groundbreaking albums like Sgt. Pepper, like Magical Mystery Tour, etc., etc. The White Album, where there was a ton of experimentation and a ton of, from a recording process standpoint, the band recording their parts and songs individually. So this was a way to get back, if you will, to just being a band again, just being 4 guys in a room and record it live, write it, rehearse it, record it, and then perform it all in a live setting, which was unique for the Beatles at the time, especially when you consider that they had not performed live in several years, so they had not seen a stage, so the public really had not seen much of them as far as, from a performance standpoint in many years. So it was a great concept, undoubtedly, and I think, going into it, it feels like Paul was really spearheading that, which he was kind of acting as the band leader, I think, for several years at that point, especially towards the end years. So again, this takes place in '69, January of '69, I believe, and what ends up coming out of it is this record right here, which is Let It Be. So we're going to talk about Let It Be and how this mix shapes up, or we could talk about how this mix shapes up with the other mixes and what all came of this. But for me, as I looked through YouTube and I started watching a few clips and highlights and reaction videos and stuff, I was trying to figure out what's an angle that would be interesting to talk about because there's just so much to consume. And for me, I was came back to like what surprised me the most. So this is my top 5 surprising moments from the film, or the top 5 things that surprised me the most. So other than Let It Be, you've got versions of this album which span many years. Let It Be Naked is a really great take that came on this, where they squashed all of Phil Spector's production that he added after the fact. So definitely check out Let It Be Naked in addition to the original cut of the album. There's also the brand new Let It Be box set, which came out recently as a companion piece to the film. There is an amazing book, which has a lot of great information. I'm still working my way through that, so I would definitely recommend checking that out. You've got the remastered version of the record. You've got the Apple sessions and rehearsals, so a lot of what you see in the film or some of the highlights are captured on this record. You've got some additional takes on what they're calling the Let It Be EP. And then, really cool, you have what was the first ever kind of mix down of the album, which was from Glenn Johns, the engineer, in the studio throughout the entire film. This was his first cut that he presented to the Beatles, which they declined. They did not end up using. It's a very fly-on-the-wall, live kind of outtakes version. And it's really cool to hear after this many years, but I completely understand why they didn't choose it, because the songs were unfinished, right? The other thing I have, which is cool, which the entire film culminates in, is the complete rooftop session. So this is an unofficial copy. This was never officially released on vinyl, but really cool to have just a representation on vinyl of that rooftop performance, which again is where the whole film culminates. But let's get to it. That's enough about records, because even though this is talking about records, we're really talking about a film here. So top 5 surprising things to me. Number 1, and I just want to get this out of the way, the first thing I was surprised about pretty early on in the film, again, it's 8 hours long, but the first thing that kind of caught my eye was the fact that Yoko is basically a non-factor. Right off the bat, as soon as they sit down in a circle in this film studio, which is Twickenham Film Studios, it's a huge, basically, bunker of, open air, huge, no vibe at all. Yoko's sitting right there, right next to John, in a chair while he's playing his guitar while they're starting to work on these songs. And at my very first impression was, oh man, this is awkward. Like, what? You always knew she was there. You've seen photos, you've seen footage over the years. Of course, the original Let It Be film came out in the early 70s, not long after this was all wrapped up. So you knew she was there, and you knew that there was a level of awkwardness, but I kind of assumed as I watched this from when she first appeared that, man, this is not going to be good. I can kind of see how awkward that would be with her being in the room. And not only in the room, but actually in the circle. They're sitting in a circle, developing these songs in real time. True creative process happening, and she's sitting right next to John. It just seems like it would be completely awkward and cause some tension. But I got to be honest with you, I was completely surprised, because after about 15-20 minutes, I don't even see Yoko anymore. She is so still. She is so quiet. And she does not interject in any way. She does not nod her head. She does not bob along to the music. It's as if she's not there. Now, that's not to be, I obviously understand that her being there at that moment is not the first moment she was there. So I'm sure there was tension leading up to her involvement and how committed John was to her and having her involved and having her there, period. So I'm not saying that Yoko's presence wasn't awkward at some point in time, but during this 3-week period, which is what the entire movie is based on and where the entire thing is written, rehearsed, recorded, and then performed, those 3 weeks, her being there had no impact. Like, I honestly, if you take Peter Jackson's word, and if you believe that he chose these 8 hours from those 50 plus hours, and you believe that he did what he said, there was a disclaimer at the beginning of the film that said he, represented everybody as realistically as possible. So if you take that and you trust that, then you got to think, hey, well, there's not hours of footage or even minutes of footage of Yoko getting into it with the band in the middle. So I was just shocked by that, because it's such an inner circle. A band is such a sacred thing. Those 4 guys have been together for so long, and for her to be sitting there, you just kind of assume that is going to create some issues and tension, and it just really doesn't. It's not there. And for a Beatles fan, all these years to always kind of think, and there's so much speculation, some of it documented speculation, which I think is now being rewritten, about her involvement in this and how detrimental her presence was. I just don't see it. And as a Beatles fan, I love that, because I've always kind of despised the fact that a third party had a major impact in breaking up the Beatles, right? Whether that's Yoko, a spouse, it could be a manager, a producer, whatever it may be. I'm glad that, at least for these 3 weeks, Yoko was not that factor. This band had its own issues, good and they had plenty of good going on. They had plenty of issues, just as every band does, just as every relationship does. It's no different. Obviously, there's a whole moment in the first episode where George actually quits the band and walks out, which is a huge thing that they have to work through. But in the end, I just don't see Yoko having an impact, and that really surprised me. I was expecting there to be some sort of tension again, and I just didn't see it, so that was really surprising to me. And again, as a Beatles fan, super kind of happy, I guess, to finally shut the door on that conversation of whether or not Yoko broke up the Beatles. She may have had a part in it, and obviously she had a huge impact on John and John's focus, and how involved he continued to be in the band and wanted to be involved in the band. But again, for this 3-week period, just don't see it. The next surprising thing I'll touch on, and I don't know if this is surprising. I guess it just kind of hits you in the face in the film, or it did for me right off the bat, is how productive George Harrison is from a songwriting standpoint. Now, I think part of this is Paul and John, they have been cranking out songs for years. And if you go back a little bit to the White Album and even a little further to Revolver, George has incredible contributions, while sparing, it's a song or two or three. Now you get to Let It Be, and you get to these sessions, and Paul's bringing in songs, John's bringing in songs, a lot, and even George bringing in songs that they have, pre-existing ideas for. Maybe it's just a riff, maybe it's a melody, maybe a lyric, whatever it may be, and they're bringing those in. And that's very typical for any writing situation. When you regroup with your band, you're getting ready to start on a project, you bring in ideas to the table. They all did that. What really struck me was that after working day after day, they were working, I think, 6 to 8 hour days straight through, kind of starting in the morning and ending in the afternoon, like a normal work day, which is very awkward for a band. Most of the time, bands don't have a schedule that is set in the middle of the day. It's just not conducive to being creative, and especially at Twickenham Film Studio, where the vibe was non-existent. It was kind of a shell of a room that they put up all these colored lights in, so it just wasn't conducive to writing, right? After all of that, after many days of that, and what you see George come back the next day, and what did he do the night after that whole long session? He went home and wrote more songs. He went home and wrote I, Me, Mine, and comes back in with it the next day. So I wrote this one the night before. Then he does the same thing with For You Blue, I think. I'm probably butchering that title. And Brown Shoe, I think, was another song. So I was just shocked that after the long day and all the stress of being creative and being involved in the room, and there was there was definitely some tension in the beginning of the film just amongst the band members themselves about the location and the project and what they were doing and all of these things. He went home and just kept writing. It's unbelievable. Would come back with fully formed ideas and songs, that a lot of which then ended up on the album. So I just found that really refreshing. And there's even one part in the film which is towards the end, where they're actually at Apple Studios now, where they moved midway through, and you actually see a conversation with George telling John that he really is ready to branch out. He's voicing, and I'm paraphrasing, that he's got so many songs, he just needs to go do his own thing to get these songs out. And of course, we now know that becomes All Things Must Pass, George's epic 3 LP first solo record. So just an incredible thing, and again, kind of surprising to me that after those long days, George just goes home and continues to write and continues to be creative, because that's not an easy thing to do. You can't really turn that on and off, but for him, it just felt like it was always on, which was really cool. And again, John and Paul they had tons of ideas as well. They just didn't show any specific moments where there was anything written in real time, other than, the song Get Back, which we'll touch on. So that's the next one, right? So George was number 2. The next one, to me, the most surprising thing, and probably my favorite moment, again, I've only watched it once, but my favorite moment of the whole documentary is in the first episode. Midway through, it makes a point to say that, some of the song ideas, and the band is going over them many times, and they're kind of not feeling it, and it's kind of getting stale. And it says Paul is searching for new song ideas, and it cuts to this shot of just Paul on his bass, and Ringo and I think George are sitting there, not even with instruments at first, and I think George kind of starts adding in a little bit after the fact. But Paul is just riffing on the bass, and he's just jamming. He's just creating, making something up on the fly. And the cameras actually catch it. They catch the moment. They catch the, they catch it at he's reaching for it. He's reaching for something, a melody, a riff. The cameras are rolling, and you hear the melody to get back come out of his mouth. You hear the vocal line come out. Not the words, just the syllables, just the phrasing. You hear the bass line. You hear the kind of gallop of the song, and he's developing it in real time. Now, keep in mind, this is how songs are written a lot of times. A lot of times, a guitar player, or any instrument, it doesn't matter if it's guitar, piano, bass, whatever it may be, sits down, and that musician is kind of playing around, and something comes out of that sporadically, right? It's just an epiphany out of thin air. You land on a few chords, you land on a riff, whatever it may be, and then that's how a song starts, right? So that's not surprising. What's surprising is the cameras were rolling and that we haven't seen this for 50 years. Such an iconic song, such an iconic Beatles song. And there was this treasure trove of obviously all the footage, but for me specifically this moment, because this was the only song, I believe, that was written in real time, right? Every other song, even the ones George has brought in, which I just mentioned, and all the songs that John and Paul bring in, they start out with Don't Let Me Down, and I Got a Feeling, and they go through all these songs. There's a lot of ideas that are already fully formed. They touch on a lot of music that ends up on Abbey Road and their solo albums. There's all these song ideas, but Get Back was really, at least during this 3-week period, it appeared to be the only song that didn't exist when they started at all, and then was finished 3 weeks later as a complete composition, as a complete song. So it was groundbreaking. It gave me chills. It was definitely, at least again after one watch, the most mind-blowing moment. The fact that we're getting to witness Paul come up with this idea in real time, and just how fluid it came. And I think the other thing you noticed, at least I did, was like, Ringo and George are sitting there, and it's no big deal. This happens, this is how songs are written. They're in the jam room. Paul's coming up with something new, no big deal. 50 years later, you can look back on it and you know how iconic of a song that became and is, and how important that moment was for this whole film, and kind of, because again, they were struggling a little bit, and I feel like that was a bit of a breakthrough. It certainly was for Paul. You can see his enthusiasm in general kind of change at that moment, and shortly after that is when they moved from Twickenham to Apple Studios, where the whole vibe changes, just because there's so much more kind of character to that room, and they're just more comfortable. You can kind of feel like they're kind of at home. So that moment where Paul, really crystallizes the idea for Get Back was just a chilling moment, and I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already watched it. Watch for that moment. You won't miss it because it's really special. So let's see, that was number 3. So we talked about Yoko, we talked about George's, being a workhorse, talked about Paul caught on camera writing Get Back as it was, as the idea came. So number 4, I think the most surprising thing to me after watching all 8 hours of this, number 4 is, I just can't believe this happened. It's so surprising to me that they actually ended up performing in any way, shape, or form. Not even on the rooftop, right? Because from the very beginning, Paul's idea was to create a documentary film that also had a companion album and culminates with live performance. So again, they're going to write it, they're going to rehearse it, they're going to record it live, and then they're going to perform it live. So the whole idea culminates with the kind of big bang at the end of them performing live, which again, they hadn't performed live in years, so that's a big deal. But all throughout the 3-week period that's being filmed, there is tension up until basically 2 days before they finish the whole thing and perform on the rooftop. There is tension around not only where they're going to do it, but if they're even going to do it. George and John basically don't have any interest in performing live at all. Ringo's, he's there and he's supportive of whatever idea comes, which is an amazing thing from his part. The patience Ringo shows is just amazing throughout this whole thing. But basically, whenever they take a break from rehearsing and writing, the film producers immediately come over right away and start talking to them. Okay, when are we going to nail this down? When are we going to do the performance? Where are we going? Are we taking a boat somewhere? Are we going to some crazy location? Are we flying fans out? Are we doing it in London somewhere? Like, there's all these ideas, some of them huge, some of them simple, but there's never a point really until the rooftop idea is presented where there's any enthusiasm around any of it. There's very little head nodding, even from Paul. He doesn't necessarily show a lot of excitement for, hey, I really want to do it this way. It's a very open-ended conversation. They just had the idea to do a live show and went into it. And throughout this three-week period, they're into every conversation, kind of brainstorming around where they should do this, but then it quickly turns into why they should do it and if they should do it and if they even want to do it. So after 3 weeks of all that debate, for it to actually happen is just surprising to me. I would think, unless there was a majority kind of enthusiasm for the idea in general, that they're the Beatles. They could just be like, you know what, forget that idea. Let's just do the film of the making of the record and put the record out. Very easily could have done that, and it very easily would have been successful and seen as very iconic. Now knowing that, they did execute the rooftop concert, which was an idea that came about just a couple days before the end of this entire film and the entire session's end, it ends up being their last performance forever, their last performance ever. And so it obviously becomes even more iconic, and I would argue that it's probably one of the most iconic moments in rock and roll history. It's the Beatles' last performance ever. It's them performing these songs live for the first time to an audience. And so it's just, again, shocking to me and surprising to me that it even happened. Thank God it did. It did create, it did really tie up the film nicely. It gave them a way to celebrate the fact that they had completed this after 3 weeks of being in the trenches, writing and rehearsing these songs. The performance was just incredibly cool too, where the fact that it did end up on the rooftop, it just kind of felt right. It wasn't, they weren't trying too hard. The hardest part about that was probably on the engineers and the producers, getting all the film equipment and the audio equipment synced up and down from the basement all the way up to the roof. But so it's amazing to watch that in full HD quality. Thank God Peter Jackson did that, because it looks amazing and it sounds amazing, and I think that's just another gift to us all, the fact that we get to see that performance in such quality. So again, surprising to me that it even happened after all the struggle, all the debate, but thank God they did finally get up to that rooftop and perform. So that's number 4. The fifth one, the last one I'll end on. I've got a couple of consolation ones, but it was hard to narrow it down to 5. The fifth one is the most surprising thing to me about the entire film. All 8 hours are taking into consideration, hey, they're there for just over 3 weeks. They wrote, rehearsed, recorded, and performed these brand new songs. They're done. The day after the rooftop concert, they go back down to the studio to record the rest of the songs and film the rest of the songs that they didn't perform on the roof, because they were more acoustic-based songs, piano-based songs, so they only did a handful of tracks on the roof. So the day after the rooftop concert, they don't go their separate ways. They go back into the studio, and this is shown in the film, and it's fascinating that they go back in, because it just feels like it's over. Nope, not for them. They go right back the next morning, just like business as usual, finish the job. And then what do? You'd think they would break for months. Like, all of this debate, all of this, tension, not necessarily bad, but just this was a very intense process creatively, them trying something new, getting back together, performing live for the first time. You think they were just like, hey, let's take some time off. Let's take a few months at least. These days it would be like taking a few years off, that type of thing. No, 3 weeks later, back in the studio, recording Abbey Road. 3 weeks after this. It's unbelievable. I always knew that the Beatles' entire catalog is condensed into a 7-year period. Like basically 63 to 70-ish is when the band existed. And so all of their albums were condensed, and they used to put out 2-3 albums a year, or at least, an album or two in singles. It was a time for popular music when that was pretty common. Bands did not wait 2-3 years to put out an album, or even 1 year. It was all about putting out putting out new music as fast as they could. And so I always knew that, Let It Be and Abbey Road, even the White Album, Let It Be, Abbey Road was always condensed. But after watching this film, after consuming 8 hours of this, and really feeling like you've got a grasp for how intense that 3-week process was creatively, and from a relationship standpoint, just you would think the guys just need a break from each other. They've been together nonstop, whatever it was, 6, 8, 10 hours a day for 3 weeks straight. They turn around after a couple week break and go in and record Abbey Road. It's just unbelievable. Now, it was pretty much an extension because, as I mentioned, and throughout the whole film, you see them and you hear them rehearsing songs that don't end up on Let It Be, that end up on Abbey Road. Whether it be she came in through the bathroom window or something. There's all kinds of moments in there where you hear them, considering songs for Let It Be, and for whatever reason, they just don't finish them at that time, or they don't quite fit in with what they're doing. The track list, I guess you could say. So they end up shelving them, but they only shelved them for 3 weeks, and then they're right back in the studio working with George Martin to produce and write and record Abbey Road, which is just absolutely mind-blowing that you can have that much output in such a short amount of time. Honestly, I think if they would have taken a break, if they would have went away, if they would have went their separate ways and come back 6 months later, maybe the Beatles could have survived. I think that workload and, I think a lot of that's driven by Paul, I think, to continue to go. That's just me speculating. I think that's kind of in his nature. But I think that's really what shut the door, because they just needed a break. They needed a break, and they kind of didn't let themselves take one. I think if they would have been more open to taking a break, it could have changed the course of whether or not they stayed together. But at the same time, George had tons of songs, 30 plus songs that ended up on, All Things Must Pass or somewhere around there. And then you had, within a very short period of time, you had all of the members in the band release their solo albums. John comes with the Yoko Ono band, the Plastic Ono band. Paul puts out his self-titled record. Ringo puts out his first record. So they all had songs piling up. So I don't know if they would have taken a break from writing and recording. They probably just would have kept working on their own, which still maybe could have helped things. But in the end, again, the fact that they go in 3 weeks later and dive right into Abbey Road, totally surprising to me. I never realized it was that close. Never realized that the time frame was that condensed. And it just shows how creative they were and how many songs they had, which is amazing. So that's my top 5 surprising things from Get Back. I am certain as I go back and watch it again, which I'm hoping and planning to do soon, that I will discover even more. The other things I had on the list, which were surprising, which didn't make a top 5, but were very close. John's even funnier than you think he is. He's always been kind of the goof in the band from the very early days, the way he kind of reacted with the press. And they were all kind of fun, obviously, but John always had this sense of humor, and it really comes out in the film, especially between him and Paul, the way they interact and the way they collaborate on songs when they're rehearsing and they're just goofing on each other's songs, which is just so fun to see. That was surprising to me. The way they collaborated, honestly, was surprising too, because again, you go into this movie, at least I went into this movie with a lot of preconceived ideas about what this was going to be, even though I watched some interviews with Peter Jackson, and basically he had said that, hey, it wasn't all doom and gloom. The reason why he actually committed to doing this because he saw the footage and saw how joyful so much of it was. The vast majority of this movie, 90% of it is them having fun, them, being friends, them interacting with each other in such a positive way. And so that the way they collaborated from a songwriting perspective, from a writing perspective, was just so refreshing to see. You kind of always kind of expected that and hoped it, but again, this was just something that kind of crystallized it, so that was surprising to me. I guess it shouldn't have been. It's the Beatles, they're great writers and collaborators, but again, for this period, going into it with all the stigma around the Let It Be sessions, I think that was surprising to me that, man, they're just collaborating, firing on all cylinders. It was great to see. Another quick thing, Ringo never talks. Like the entire 8 hours, Ringo says like 10 words. It's unbelievable. The guy is solid as a rock. He sits there and you know what he does? He listens. That's why he's an amazing drummer. He just listens. He consumes all of these amazing songs that are being written slowly but surely. He starts out, he's just keeping time. And by the end of 3 weeks, he's got all of his fills perfectly placed. So underrated, incredible drummer. But he never says a thing. It's unbelievable. Two more quick things that were surprising. Again, this is way past the five. No, they were all kids. They were all kids. None of them were even 30 years old during this period. And then they broke up after this, and the Beatles were over, and none of them they weren't even adults. They're just in their 20s. It's unbelievable. That much production as, early, mid 20-year-olds. Completely shocking. Like, you can do the math, but just to realize that in the context of this is unbelievable. The last thing I'll mention, it was really surprising to me that George Martin basically had no involvement here. Glenn Johns, who was technically the engineer, was really more of the producer, and he had very little involvement. Producers on records usually are very hands-on, especially producer that has a lot of clout and has worked with a lot of artists, which at this time Glenn Johns had. And he came in, he just let them do what they were going to do. It was very evident that they were producing this themselves. There was no like, hey, we should try this again. We should try it like this. We should change this instrument. We should, work through issues. The Beatles were producing themselves. This was a self-produced product. Unbelievable. I think they went back to using George more on Abbey Road. But for this project, which was really meant to be a live, raw, back to the beginning type of vibe of just, again, four guys in a room. So it was interesting to me just to see the lack of outside influence, which was, again, refreshing. You get the idea that these songs ended up the exact way that the four guys in the Beatles wanted them. No outside influence was there, which was really cool to see. So if you haven't already watched this movie, you've got to check it out. It's a behemoth. It's 8 hours, but it's worth every minute of your time to commit to this if you're a Beatles fan, and I think more so just a music fan to be a fly on the wall while something like this is being created, again, is just a gift. And I'm so glad that Peter Jackson put in the time to do this right. I hope to see more outtakes and more footage over the years, but as Peter Jackson has said, if you watch interviews with him, the reason why this thing ended up being 8 hours, it was supposed to be a 2.5 hour film. The first cut was 18 hours. He trimmed it down to 6 and went back up to 8. And the reason why he said that is because he had this fear that whatever didn't make the cut was never going to be seen again for, another 50 years, if ever. Like, they'll probably, who knows when someone else will revisit this to go extract more out of it, if ever, right? I kind of think maybe not. Like, this is probably it. So very excited that he did that and he committed to it and gave us a huge chunk of this history for us to absorb, because otherwise we never would have experienced it, and we would have just still been going off of hearsay and reading. There's so many books and so much documented from this area that now is being rewritten, and that's just super exciting as a music fan to know that kind of the record has been set straight. So thanks for listening. That went way longer than I anticipated, but I don't care because this film is that good and it deserves the attention. I've been watching other YouTube videos and reactions and things, and it's just amazing to see how people are gravitating towards this. I know it has consumed me. I think if you'll watch it, it'll consume you. It's an amazing film and an amazing document of, in my opinion, the greatest band of all time. So thanks again. I'm G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl. If you made it this far, really appreciate it. Go watch the film. You won't regret it. Carve out some time and enjoy. Thanks so much.